So here we are in Poughill. I hope I pronounced that right. I was told it was Poughill like offal. Cool, fabulous. And to St Olaf Parish Church. The building mainly dates to the 15th century, with some parts dating to the 14th and 16th centuries. It's thought to have its origins in the 11th century, and it's mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086 AD, which, for those of you that don't know, which you probably all do, a comprehensive survey of England and parts of Wales, which is commissioned by King William I, or William the Conqueror. The church had at least 5 guilds in the 1520s, including one to St Christopher and one to St Olaf. And so the dedication to St Olaf likely dates back to at least the 16th century. The 2 obvious wall paintings likely date to the 1470s, now representing St Christopher and St Olaf. They were rediscovered during restoration work in around about 1894 and somewhat restored, and they were further heavily altered in the 1950s by a fellow called Frank Salisbury. More international saint cults emerged in Cornwall from the turn of the 10th century onwards, and they seem to increase during the medieval period. As we've said, we see the Normans come in and we see more outside of Cornwall saints being venerated. While some saint dedications became forgotten, in the 18th century, Olaf was fondly remembered in popular folklore as Dydh, meaning St Olaf Day. So as with the St Christopher painting, so with this one we're looking at for a minute, in St Breca Church in Brig, and alluding to the parable of St Christopher, Jesus, the Christ child, is depicted on his shoulder, usually his right shoulder. The brilliance of saint iconography in Western Christian art is that every saint has one or more associated items or symbols, usually associated with their respective parables, which makes identification relatively simple. As such, St Christopher is almost always depicted carrying a staff, and St Olaf's crown, so we're looking at this side now, was said to have been added during the first Victorian era intervention, but this is only noted in one source. The crown supports the theory that one painting was altered to depict St Olaf, the King of Norway, from 1015 to 1028 AD. But first, to his godfather, Olaf Tryggvason, King of Norway from 995 to 1000 AD. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a set of annals in Old English thought to have been written in the late 9th century, there was a Scandinavian raid on Padstow in 981. In this year, St Petrock Stow, and we know Stow means holy place in Old English, now known as Padstow, was ravaged. And that same year was much harm done everywhere by the sea coast, as well as among the men of Devon and the Welsh. Could one of the raiders of Padstow have been King Olaf I of Norway, aka Olaf Tryggvason? According to the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, written in circa 1190 AD by Oda Snorrason, he went raiding in the 980s following the death of his Wendis wife, Gira. However, other sources say that Olaf met Gira in 982, and he supposedly stayed with her for 3 years prior to raiding. It must be remembered that the saga was written over 2 centuries later, and early medieval dates are often conflicting between different sources, as we discussed at our last church. For more on Olaf Tryggvason, you can see something called Project Forlog, which is at sagi.vikinggov.cz. Important in the conversion of the Norse to Christianity, Olaf I did so forcibly within his own kingdom. And now, to his godson, the future Olaf II of Norway, who was locally canonized as a saint in 1031 AD, a year after his death in the Battle of Stiklestad, trying to reconquer his throne. His canonization was confirmed by the Catholic Church in 1164 AD. During his life, he further encouraged the spread of Christianity throughout Scandinavia. Olaf II's significant role in the spread of Christianity in Norway likely contributed to his elevation to patron saint of Norway, and his cult spread southwards across the North Sea. As well as the Poughill dedication, in Ireland there are 2 known churches dedicated to St Olaf, also known as St Olave. St Olave's Church in Dublin, no longer surviving, once located on what is now Fishamble Street, and St Olaf's Church in Waterford. There was also a St Olaf's Church in Exeter, and all 4 churches have historical connections to Olaf II. Their buildings' erection dates are thought to be roughly contemporaneous. Poughill in the 11th century, Exeter founded in 1053, Dublin thought to be 12th century, and Waterford founded 1050 AD. But there were also a handful of churches in southeast England dedicated to St Olaf, including in London. But now, back to the paintings. and more specifically to analysing the one supposedly depicting St Olaf. In the story of St Christopher, he carries people across the river, whereas the painting depicts boats and a mermaid, which could imply it is instead the sea. His outfit is of a different style to the man in the other painting, and he wears what looks like a royal seal type finger ring. So that one up there is very similar to a royal seal type ring that kings would wear. The figure on his shoulder is ambiguous. Is it Jesus or perhaps a cherubim? If Jesus, one might expect to see a halo, so perhaps it isn't Jesus. The figure is pointing, and it looks like he is pointing in the direction of one of the churches. And nearby to this church is what appears to be a monk, dressed in the traditional garb of Anglicised monks. The hooded figure, let's assume he is a monk, looks like he is holding a lantern. Is he guiding the central character safely to shore? The churches appear in the Romanesque style of the Anglo-Norman churches and feature only on one side of the water. Each landmass features a stone cross, but they are depicted in different styles. Is this to signify two different branches of Christianity, perhaps from two different countries? And if this is the case, is the overall message of the painting conveying the spread of Christianity across seas? And finally, in each corner of the border, there portrays what looks like the Rose of York, which would coincide with the estimated creation date of the 1470s AD for these paintings, because that was when Henry VI was on the throne, and we know obviously he was of the York House, for those of you that are into the Wars of the Roses. So now, how can we tell if the paintings are contemporaneous, and what elements were added when? The Victorian Restoration and all the 1950s repaintings are so thick you cannot macroscopically, so with your eye, decipher the original lines, and so it cannot be disproven that a crown existed in the original painting. Its presence is plausible, especially considering the only evidence for it as a later edition comes from one small Victorian watercolour painting. The thickness of the paintings also makes it difficult to know what is repainted original and what are later embellishments. As for similarities, all of the following are painted similarly: the fish, the churches, the land and the bushes, and so the paintings could be contemporaneous. However, there are also several differences between them, especially in the faces, with subtle differences in facial features between the two men. Faces and wall paintings are never usually conserved, as the chance of repainting them 100% exactly like the original is incredibly slim. This is because the faces become the painter's hallmark, and in other parts of Europe particularly, it is the faces which help researchers determine the artists or school of painters who are commissioned to paint in which buildings. These subtle differences may therefore imply that these two figures were painted by two different painters, and possibly at different times. And finally, what did the writing on the banner behind St Christopher's head say? Again, the Victorian watercolour suggests, "Bear I never so heavy a burden." Was this the original sentiment, formulated at the time of the original campaign, or part of a later edition? However, St Christopher is often painted on the north wall of churches because their entranceway is usually the south door, and thus by facing the main entranceway, people can easily view his likeness, perhaps even without needing to enter the church, and with a small glance as they pass by en route elsewhere. In the case of Poughill specifically, both doors were thought to have been used regularly by churchgoers, and so it's extremely plausible that both paintings were originally of St Christopher. It is possible that the parish church at Poughill was not always dedicated to St Olaf, and this was a later rededication, either accompanying or replacing an earlier one. As a way of honouring this new saint dedication, it may have been decided to morph one St Christopher into St Olaf. Perhaps the north door was less used, and so that is why the congregation chose to modify the painting on the south wall. Therefore, the now St Olaf is likely nothing more than a crowned St Christopher by another name. With extensive building work in the 14th century, either Christopher became Olaf then, or like we suggested, perhaps in the 16th century when we have the Guild of St Olaf, or during the Victorian restorations. Beyond that, a more narrow date window of alteration is open to speculation. The suggested next step on heavily altered paintings would be to use optical coherence tomography, OCT, and or macro X-ray fluorescence to reveal previous paint layers. This would put to rest several questions and something to think about, like How much was altered by the Victorians? How much of the 1950s restoration was in fact reinvention? And when did Christopher receive that crown? Thank you.